My second collection of poems was called The Lundy's Letter and was published in 1985. I collected the poems together throughout the late 70s and early 80s. And when I put them all together, I realized that there was a kind of coherent theme emerging out of some of them. And it was the look back to the Belfast history and landscape and culture that I had grown up in. And I was reading a fascinating book, a history of Edward Carson, a man who politically I would have had very little in common with. But the story goes that when he addressed a very large audience on the shores of Belfast Lough in 1912, there were thousands upon thousands of ordinary working class Protestants had assembled there to hear his great speech. A bit like Daniel O'Connell in a way. And when he left the shore, moved back into Belfast city centre, he attended a lunch in the Ulster Club, and then he moved from the city centre to the harbour, where he was leaving on a ship, and the ship was called the Patriotic, and he was heading off to the mainland, as it would have been known in those days. Anyway, a little detail of this event stuck with me, and I found it intriguing, because when he stepped into the carriage, the men who were around the club unshackled the horses that would have been taking the carriage down to the ship, and they pulled the carriage manually. I thought it was an extraordinary metaphor of these ordinary men and women bestowing such honour upon a man who, a Dublin-born man, whose class and background would have been so completely different from their own, and yet this act of reverence alongside the address that he had given struck me anyway as being a kind of an interesting story that hadn't really been marked before in any way. I was also reading a wonderful novelist and poet and critic, Aidan Matthews. And Aidan had written an article for The Crane Bag, a literary journal of the time of the 70s and 80s. And this particular article that he had written was called A Question of Covenants. So like a magpie, I jumped on that title and I stole it. And it becomes the title for this poem because, as people will know or may not know, the covenant is a great image and symbol of civic trust inside Scottish and Northern Irish Protestantism. The Covenanteers always felt that there was a renegotiable relationship between the state and its people, a bit like the Kirk and its clergy and the people who go to that church, and that the relationship between all these was actually written down. So I call this poem A Question of Covenants, and it's dated the 28th of September 1912, because that was the date in which huge numbers of ordinary men and women from Northern Ireland signed some of them they're in blood, signed their names against a covenant opposing Home Rule. And as we know where that led to. But I was intrigued by this forgotten history And it became one of those poems in that earlier volume of mine, The Lundy's Letter. It's a true story. A Question of Covenants, 20th of September, 1912. The patriotic turns to face an invisible sea. From Castle Place, thousands swarm through side streets and along unprotected quays, just to glimpse Carson, gaunt as usual, who watches the surge of people call, "Don't leave us, you mustn't leave us." And in the searchlight's beam, his figure arched across the upper deck, he shouts he will come back and, if necessary, fight this time. It is what they came to hear in the dark September night. As the patriotic sails out, Union colours burst in rockets, and bonfires scar the hills he departs from. A stranger to both sides of the loch's widening mouth, and the crowd's distant singing, Auld Lang Syne and God Save the King.